Chapter 17 The June Moon. Now every day Eric was becoming acquainted with strange forest people, those who had hidden away from winter in trees, and those who were wandering up from the south along with the birds, and blue water people, of course, all along the forest streams. The forest teemed with new playmates for him and Ivra. Hide-and-go-seek was still the favorite game, and now it was more fun to be it than to be hiding almost, for one was likely to come upon strangers peeping out of tree hollows, swimming under water, or swinging in the tree tops any minute. When the person who was it came across one of these strangers, he would simply say, "I spy," and "You're it." Then he would draw the stranger away to the goal, where he usually joined the game, and was as much at home as though he had been playing in it from the very first. The day that Eric found Wild Thyme so was the best of all, or rather she was the best of all, and that was strange, for when he first spied her he did not like her at all. Her dress was a purple slip, just to her knees, with a big rent in the skirt. Her hair was short and bushy and dark, and her face was soberer than most forest people's faces. She was sitting out at the edge of the forest on a flat rock, her chin in her hands, and she did not look eager to make friends with anyone. But he cried, "I spy, you're it," just the same. She did not lift her eyes, she only said, "You must catch me first. I am Wild Thyme, and that will be hard." Eric laughed, for she was not a yard away from him, and he sprang forward as he laughed, but she was quicker than he. She had been at perfect rest on the rock, her chin in her hands, and not looking at him, but the instant he jumped, she was off like a flash, a purple streak across the field. But Eric did not let his surprise delay him. He ran after her just as fast as he could, and that was very, very fast, for running with Ivra had taught him to run faster than most Earth children ever dream of running. Soon Wild Thyme slowed down a little and faced him, running backward, her bushy hair raised from her head. In the wind of her running, her little brown face and great purple eyes gleaming mischievously. Eric sprang for her. She dodged. He sprang again. She dodged again. He cried out in vexation and sprang again, straight and sure. He caught her by her bushy hair as she turned to fly, and a strange thing happened to him in, in that second. The second he caught her hair, instead of Wild Thyme and the sunny field, he was looking at the sea. He was standing on the shore, looking away and away, almost to foreign lands. Now, ever since that spring night on the shore, he had been thinking of the sea, and longing with all his might to cross it, and see foreign lands for himself. Only that had seemed impossible, and something he must surely wait till he was grown up to do. But now, in a flash, as his fingers closed on Wild Thyme's hair, he knew that he could indeed do that, and anything else he really set his heart on. No girl, even a fairy, likes to have her hair pulled. So Wild Thyme was angry. She pinched Eric's arm with all her strength. Then he was angry, And so they stood holding each other, her by the hair and she him by the arm, staring hotly into each other's faces. But slowly they relaxed, and becoming their own natural selves again, broke into laughter. "You'll play with us, won't you?" Eric asked. "Of course," she said, "and I am it." And away they ran to find the others, Ivra, the tree girl, the forest children, and Dan and Nan. When those saw who it was Eric had captured, they ran to meet her, shouting gaily, "Wild Thyme, goody goody!" "Hello, Wild Thyme!" They seemed to have known her always. She and Ivra threw their arms about each other's shoulders and danced away to the goal. Wild Thyme was a wonderful playfellow. She was so wild, so free, so strong, so mischievous, and when the game was ended, she invited them to a dance that very night. "It's to be around the treeman's tree," she said, "and all come when the moon rises." Perhaps Eric's good times in the forest reached their very height that June night of the dance. He had never been to a dance before, and just at first he did not think there would be much fun in it. But Ivra wanted him to go, and offered to show him about the dances, so they ran away from the others to the edge of the field where Eric had discovered Wild Thyme, and there, on the even grassy ground, Ivra showed him how to dance. It was very easy. Not at all like the dances Earth children dance. It was much more fun and much livelier. The dances were just whirling and skipping and jumping, each dancer by himself, but all in a circle. Eric liked it as well as though it had been a new game. Late that afternoon, Helma and Ivra and Eric gathered ferns and flowers to deck themselves for the evening. They put them on over the stream, which was the only mirror in the forest. Helma made a girdle of brakes for herself and a dandelion wreath for her hair. She wove a dear little cap of star flowers for Ivra, and a chain of them for her neck. Eric crowned himself with bloodroot and contrived grass sandals for his feet, but the sandals, of course, wore through before the end of the first dance, and fell off. They had a splendid supper of raspberries and cream, which they sat on the door stone to eat, and then told stories to each other, while they waited for the moon to rise. It came early, big and round and yellow, shining through the trees, flooding the aisles of the forest with silver light until they looked like still streams, and the trees like masts of great ships standing in them. Then the three hurried away to the treeman's. They ran hand in hand through the forest aisles, their faces as bright to each other as in daylight. But before they even came in sight of the tree, they heard music. Thrum, 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 thrum. Very soft, very insistent, very simple and strangely thrilling. When they came to the tree, there were the forest children, who had come early, whirling around in a circle, and the tree girl in the center of the circle making music, with a tiny instrument she held in one hand and touched with the fingers of the other. Soon forest people began arriving from every direction. There were the blue water children, bright pebbles around their necks, and white seashells in their blue hair. The forest children were crowned with maidenhair fern. The tree girl was the most beautiful of all in her silver cobweb frock and her cloudy hair. The treeman stood still in the shadow, but his long white beard gleamed out, and his deep eyes. Wild Thyme wore a rope of the flower that is named for her around her neck, but there was a new rent in her purple frock, and her legs were scratched, as though she had remembered her dance only the last minute and come plunging the shortest way through the bushes, which was true. Thrum, 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 thrum. Every one except the treeman was dancing, bewitched, in the moonlight, all over the grassy space around the great tree. The grass was cool and refreshing under Eric's bare feet, and he often dug his bare toes into the soft earth at its roots as he leapt or ran, just to make sure he was on earth at all, for he felt as though he were swimming in moonlight, or at least treading it. Thrum, 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 thrum. When the tree girl's music stopped between dances, then it would go on in Eric's head. It was just the sound of the night, after all. Once Eric noticed that the beautiful wicked witch was dancing next to him in the circle, but he was not afraid of her, there with the others, and in bright moonlight, and she was plotting no ill. Her face was sparkling with delight, and she had utterly forgotten herself in the dance. When the great moon hung just above them, and shadows were few and far between, the tree mother came walking through the forest, quieter and more beautiful than the moon. Wild Thyme ran to her and laid her bushy head against her breast, for Wild Thyme only of all the forest people loved her without awe. The tree mother put her hand on Wild Thyme's head and stood to watch the dancing. Her robe gleamed like frost, and her hair was a pool of light above her head. Thrum, 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 thrum. Wild Thyme jumped back into the dance, and the tree mother stood alone. But although she stood as still as a moonbeam under the tree, she made Eric think of dancing more than all the others put together. It was her eyes. The thrum, 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 thrum was in them, and the rest of that night Eric felt as though the music instrument the tree girl was swinging was silent, and that all the music flowed from Tree Mother. But Eric, after all, was only an earth child, and his legs got very tired, in spite of the music and the moonlight. So at last he slipped out of the circle, and stumbling with weariness and sleepiness, went to Tree Mother. She picked him up in her arms, and the minute his head touched her shoulder, he was sound asleep. The music at last hushed in his head. When he woke, it was summer dawn. The birds were flitting above in the tree boughs, and making high singing. He was alone, lying beneath a silver birch, his head among the star flowers. He knew that Helma and Ivra had not wanted to wake him, but had gone home when the moon set, and were waiting breakfast for him there now. So he jumped up and ran home through the dew. Chapter 18. The Deepest Place in the Wood. It was on the hottest day of all the hot days of summer that Eric found the deepest place in the forest. He wandered into it while he was looking for Wild Thyme. Ivra had been no good to him that day. She was usually ready to play in any weather, but on this the hottest day of the year, she stayed indoors, where it was a little cooler, and lying on the settle, she drew paper dolls on birch bark, and afterwards cut them out. Yes, even fairy children love paper dolls, and Ivra loved them more than most. Eric wanted her to go swimming in the stream, but he teased her too in vain, for she was entranced with the dolls, and would hardly lift her eyes from them. Helma was swinging in a vine swing she had made for herself high in a tree above the garden. One of the little people was perched on a leaf just over her head, and they were chattering together like equals. Their eager voices floated down to Eric standing disconsolate near the door stone. But Helma usually knew when her children were in trouble, no matter how tiny the trouble, and so before Eric had stood there long, or dug up more than a bushel of earth with his bare toes, she leaned over the nest and called to him. "Why don't you go and play with Wild Thyme? She doesn't mind the heat. Every one else is staying quiet till sundown." Wild Thyme was a happy thought, and Eric walked away in search of her, but she was in the very last place he would have thought to look on such a scorching day, and that is how he missed her. She was lying full length on the hot burnt grass in the field at the forest edge, loving the heat and sunshine, which covered her like a mantle. If Eric had seen her, it is possible he would not have known her, or stopped to look twice. He would have thought her just a little patch of flowers that is named for her. So he wandered on, looking high and low and all about for her, and he went deeper and deeper into the forest. The deeper he went, the cooler it became, for the forest roof kept out the sunshine. The light grew dimmer and dimmer too. Eric had never been so far in before, and everything was strange to him. He saw no forest people except a little brown goblin, who peered at him from some underbrush and then scuttled away into the darkness of denser brush. Eric had never seen a goblin before, but he had no fear of goblins, and so this one did not bother him at all. He heard others scuttling and squeaking, and one threw a chunk of gray moss at him. He stopped and picked it up and threw it back, with a laugh in the direction it had come from. "Come out and play, why don't you?" he called. "I know where there's a fine swimming pool." But there was no answer to his invitation. Instead, there was sudden and utter silence. He was disappointed, for he did want a playmate, and he had almost given up looking for Wild Thyme. After walking for a long while, he came at last to one of the windings of the forest stream, and gratefully stepped into the shallow, clear water, dark with shadows. His feet were burning, and his head was hot, so he drank a long drink of the cold, delicious water, ducked his head, and finally washed his face. Then he waded on with no purpose in mind, now but just to keep his feet in the water. It was so he came to the deepest place, where not even Ivra had ever been. It was almost cool there, and more like twilight than early afternoon, and right in the deepest place, in a nest of smooth leaves, With his feet in the water lay Wild Star. When Eric first caught sight of him, he thought he was asleep, for his wings were lying on the leaves, half folded and drooped, and his knees were higher than his head. But when Eric went close enough to see his eyes, he knew that he was very wide awake, for they were wide open, watchful and intent, and purple like the early morning. Such wide-awake eyes were startling in such a sleepy, still place. Eric expected him to spread his wings in a flash and dart away, but the wings stayed half open, purple shadows on the leaves, and Wild Star did not even raise his head, only his eyes greeted Eric. But Eric knew without words that Wild Star was glad to see him, so he stepped up out of the water and stretched himself on a mound of silvery moss nearby. With his chin resting in his palms and his elbows supporting, he faced the wind creature, his clear blue eyes open to the intent purple ones. It was Wild Star who spoke first. "I thought, little Eric, you would have crossed the sea before this, and be out of the forest. I expected to find you next fall on the other side of the world." Eric was amazed, for he had not said one word of his dream about that to anyone. "How did you know I wanted to go?" he cried. "Oh, you are an Earth child, after all, and I knew you would want to be going on as soon as you saw the sea." "But why do I want to go on?" asked Eric, his face clouding with the puzzle of it. "I am so happy here, and Helma is my mother now. There can't be another mother across the sea for me, and if there were I wouldn't want her, not after Helma. No, Helma is my only mother, and Ivra is my comrade, and still I want to leave them, and go on and away over there. It is very funny." "No," said Wild Star, "it isn't funny. You are a growing Earth child, not a fairy. It is your own kind calling you. It is the music of your human life." "I don't know what you mean," said Eric. "It is like this. You know, when you begin to sing a song, you go on and on to the end without thinking about it at all. It is the theme that carries you. Well, a human life is made like a song. It carries itself along. You do not stop to think why. It can't stop in the middle on one chord for long. Yours now is resting on a chord of happiness, but soon it will go on again. You want it to. Life in the forest, though, isn't like that. Here it is music without any theme, like the music we dance to. Thrum, 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 thrum. But there is more than that to an Earth child's life. It runs on like this stream. The stream is happy here in the forest too, but it goes on seeking the sea just the same." There was a long stillness while Eric looked down into the green depths of the water. At last he asked, "But how could I ever get across the sea? And when I got there, how could I get back?" "Time enough to think about getting back, when you are there," laughed Wild Star. "But as to getting there, Helma is the one to tell. You that. She has been an Earth child too, you know. She felt just as you did. That spring night on the shore, she has felt it many times. It is only Ivra that keeps her in the forest. Ivra does not belong out in the world of humans, and Helma will never leave her, but she will understand your longing. All you have to do is tell her. Eric clapped his hands, a habit he had caught from Ivra. "Oh, I shall cross in a ship," he cried, "and see all the foreign lands, and when I come back, think of the world stories I shall have to tell Helma and Ivra." He sprang up in his joy, and felt as though he had wings on his shoulders like Wild Star, and had only to spread them out to go beating around the world. For a second, the Wind Creature and the Earth Child looked very much alike, and indeed the only difference was that Wild Star had to wait for the wind, and Eric need wait for no wind or no season. His wings were inside of his head, but they were as strong as Wild Star's, and he had only to spread them and lift them to go anywhere he wanted. Now he wanted to get back to Helma and tell her all about it. Wild Star pointed him the shortest way, and off he ran, jumping the stream and the moss beds beyond, and disappearing into the underbrush. "I'll look for you next time the other side of the world," Wild Star shouted after him. It was twilight when he reached home. Helma and Ivra were sitting on the door stone, hand in hand. They made room for Eric, but he did not snuggle up. He stayed erect, his face lifted towards the first dim stars, and told Helma all about his wanting to go away from them out through the forest and across the sea, and all that Wild Star had said about music and Earth people's lives, and he told her, too, of the vision of success he had had when he caught Wild Thyme that first day by her bushy hair. Helma listened quietly, and said nothing for many minutes after he was through, but at last she spoke, putting a hushing hand on Eric's dreamful head. "I understand," she said. "I know you would want to go on some time, and I have a friend across there who will help us. He has a school for boys, and I got to know him very well behind the gray stone wall. He asked me about the forest and you children, and he said that Eric sometime would surely want to go back to humans, and when he did he would help him. He understands boys. It is to him you had better go, Eric, and when you are really ready I will tell you how, and start you on your way." Eric sighed with contentment and leaned his head against Helma's shoulder, but Ivra stayed at her mother's other side, as still and silent as a shadow. Soon the fireflies began their nightly dance in the garden, but Ivra did not go darting after them as usual to make their dance the swifter, and Eric's head was too full of dreams, and his eyes too full of visions of the sea to notice them at all. Chapter 19. More Magic in a Mist. Indian summer had come round again before Eric really made up his mind to go. The flowers were asleep in the garden, and there was a steady, gentle shower of yellow leaves down the forest. That morning, when he woke, the little house seemed suspended in a golden mist. As he stood in the doorway, he felt as though it might drift away up over the trees and into space any minute. But after a little he knew it was not Helma's little forest house that was to go swinging away into space and adventure. It was himself, and suddenly he wanted to go then, to the sea, and over and beyond. He called the news in to Helma and Ivra, who were still within doors. Helma came swiftly out to him. "The trees are beckoning again, Mother," he cried, "the way they did a year ago when I first came here. Now it is just as Wild Star said. The music is beginning to go on. There's magic out today. Oh, what made Wild Star know so much?" "Sit down," said Helma. She took his hand and drew him down beside her on the door stone. Then she held it firmly while very slowly and distinctly, but once only, she gave him directions about how to go, where to go, and what to do, so that he might follow the magic. Eric sat and listened attentively, in spite of the high beating of his heart and the magic working in his head. As soon as she was done, he wanted to go right away that minute, for even in his happiness, he knew that saying goodbye to all his friends in the forest would be too sad a task. They did not say goodbye when they went on long adventures or followed summer south. They simply disappeared one day, and those who stayed behind forgot them until next season. So Eric would do as they. Only last week Helma had made him a warm brown suit for the coming winter. The new strong sandals on his feet he had made himself. His cap was new too, and Helma had stuck 2 new little brown feathers in it, as in the old one, so he still had a look of flying. There was really nothing to delay his departure further. Helma called to Ivra, and she came out slowly. There was no need to explain things to her, for she had heard everything. Helma lifted Eric's chin in her palms and looked long and earnestly at the child she was letting go away from her all alone out into the queer world of Earth people. She picked him up in her strong arms then, as though he were a very little boy, and kissed him. She ran with him to the opening in the hedge and set him down there laughing. "Run along now round the world," she said, "and when you come back bring 100 new world stories with you." Eric laughed too, and promised, and stood on tiptoes to kiss her again. He stroked her short flower-petal hair and kissed her cool brown cheek over and over, but he did not cling to her, and he did not say another word, but ran to catch up with Ivra, who was to walk with him until noon, and had gone on ahead. The children did not scuffle through the banks of leaves, or jump and run and burst into play, as they were used to doing. They walked steadily forward, saying very little, neither hurrying nor delaying their steps. Once, when Eric's sandal came untied, Ivra knelt to fix it, for she was still more skillful with knots than he. But when the sun showed that it was noon, Ivra's steps grew slower and slower, dragged and dragged, until at last she stood still in a billow of leaves. "I have to go back now," she said. In a flash, all the magic swept out of the day for Eric. He knew he could never say goodbye to Ivra, so he stayed silent, looking ahead into the fluttering golden forest. But even as he looked, the trees began to beckon with their high fingers, and way away, down long avenues of trees, he almost glimpsed the sea. Ivra threw her arms about his neck and kissed him. "Goodbye, comrade," was all she said. He kissed her cheeks. "I'll come back," he promised, but before he had gone many steps he turned to see her again. She was standing in the billow of leaves, a lonely-looking little girl, her face paler than it had been even on that day of the wind hunt. He wanted to run back to her and tell her he would be her playmate always, and never leave the forest, but he wanted, too, to go on and across the sea and into foreign lands. He stayed irresolute, and then, quite suddenly, standing just behind Ivra, he saw Tree Mother. She was not looking at him at all, but at Ivra, and her eyes were kind stars. When Ivra turned to go home, she must walk right into Tree Mother's arms and against her breast. So Eric was happy again. Ivra could not be lonely with dear Tree Mother. Perhaps she would take her up in her airboat, high above the falling leaves, where she could look down on the magic. He waved, calling, "Remember me to the Snow Witches when they come." That was not because he really wanted to be remembered to them, but because he knew that Ivra liked them best of all, and it would please her. She nodded and waved too, and threw him a kiss. Then a shower of fluttering leaves came between the playmates. When it was clear again, Eric had run on out of sight, and was lost to Ivra in the forest. On and on and on, through the showers of golden leaves he went, magic at his elbow and around him, and beckoning ahead of him. And after long walking and many thoughts, at last he did see the sea, gleaming blue and white sparkles between the golden trees.